by saying I've actually had quite a lot of research grants, and I don't try to say that sort of to brag. It's honestly just the way it worked out, and it kind of surprised me. So what I'm going to tell you about is how did this happen that I developed these projects. And what you'll find is that although it looks like a lot of different projects, in fact what it is a series of very closely interlinked projects that were done through a variety of different grants. So it's not really so many different projects as you might think. This story begins actually with when Alan Luke first came and CRPP first started. And I don't know how many of you were around in those days, but I didn't know Alan Luke and he didn't know me, and we didn't really know what CRPP was going to be like or how it would evolve into OER. But he called me into his office one day and said, "You've been working on this other project that was an international comparison of schools. Why don't you work on something on Singapore?" And I said, well, I thought about that, but actually my background is in second language acquisition, and what I found out from that project is that English as a second language in Singapore isn't quite the way that it was in the US, and so my background is a little bit different, and I'm thinking about how to reshape that, and he said, yeah, that's a good idea. Okay, and he said, why don't you write me a research grant? And I said, well, okay, when do those due? And it was in about a week's time, and I was leaving the next morning to go overseas for 2 months, and so I said, sure, I can do that. And so I stayed up all night, and I wrote a research grant, which was funded. And I must say, it's true, in those days, I do think the procedures were a little bit simpler than they are now. So I acknowledge. But anyway, that's how I got my first grant at NIE. And so I produced that grant, and I went away for my leave, and I came back, and it was, you've got the grant, now do the study. Okay, I can do that. So I think one thing that we might want to bear in mind, and I think that I hear this in the two previous presentations as well, is there's one aspect of the research that has to do with our interest and expertise, but there's another aspect of the research that has to do with take advantage of the opportunities that are offered to you. And so I started with the first project, which is the one at the bottom of the screen, which was a kind of a pilot study. Because of my background in second language acquisition, I was interested in peer work in classrooms. And because of the international project I had done, I knew that teachers in Singapore were telling me they couldn't do peer work in classes. It didn't work. It wasn't possible. The children spoke Singlish. The children used too much Chinese. And I said, you know what? We can research that. We can find out if that is in fact what happens. And so my first project was a pilot study to find out how students responded to peer work. And that actually went pretty well. And there wasn't as much Singlish and code switching as teachers thought, and et cetera, et cetera. And so we did the next project, which was to try to implement peer work in classrooms, developing materials and working with teachers. Oh no, we didn't. Sorry, the next project was, yes, that was, yeah. And so we did the next project, we were working with the teachers. And then we went on to see about what would happen if we did it at other schools, because one of the comments that I got about my research was, well, it's all at a girls' school, and maybe it'd be different if you were at a neighborhood school or a mixed gender school. And so then we did a study where we looked to see what was happening at other schools. And the moral of my story, if there is one, is it builds, right? When I first started off thinking about studying peer work, I knew that I wanted to do first a look at the development of materials through a pilot study, and then intervention in a school, working with a school. I hadn't anticipated that I would also go to other schools and examine whether or not my results would be generalizable. But I would say for the most part, this particular research agenda was planned from the beginning. I had in mind to do a series of studies building on what I was interested in, what I thought was possible, but developing it step by step to see how it would work as I went along. So this was pretty much a planned agenda, even though it came as sort of a surprise to me that I had to write the grant overnight. All right, the thing is, it didn't start there. So I had this agenda in mind of how I wanted to do an intervention with teachers in school, but at the same time, while I was working on those projects, I found out that there were some other things that I needed to think about, and one of those was, how do I share this data? Now, sharing the findings, okay, you do publications, you do presentations, but I ended up with over 100 classroom lessons, transcripts, peer work materials, in boxes in my office. So what am I going to do with that? So then I became very interested in this idea of how do we share our research, and what about issues of secondary data analysis, data storage, etc. And so that resulted in the first project, which was just like an SUG about what are some possibilities within the NIE context of sharing data. And I'll just give you the short answer on that was actually not much at that time. So that was one thing that we knew, is that there's an issue that we needed to work on that. The other thing that was an offshoot is the teachers had said the students will use Singlish and Chinese, and we were able to come back and say, you know what, they don't actually do that much. Most of the time their English is pretty good, but they do that sometimes. And so then the second interest was, why do they do it sometimes? Sort of what's the rule that seems to be operating? And so that became this project on linguistic hybridity, which I'm still working on now as we try and figure out what the rules are the students operate with. But again, I was working with an international colleague, and so the question came up, how do we share the data? How do we do this together? And so I also continued to work on this third project, is how do we develop a corpus based on the data that we already have and the structures for IRB and ethical sharing, etc. So the moral for this part is, although you might be developing a research agenda in one area, there can be connected ideas and concepts that are very interesting and worth pursuing. In all of these projects, I worked with co-PIs who had a strong interest in that area and who really helped to support the work. So I didn't have to take on all of that by myself. And then the next idea was that as I was working on these projects on peer work and data sharing, the school that I had been working with came back to me and said, well, are you interested in doing another project? Opportunity knocked. Sure, I can do that. I'm happy to do another project, but we found out that the teachers who had been involved in the peer work project had not continued to use the materials that we had introduced to them during the project. Why not? We suspected that the time period was simply not long enough to get that really instantiated in their teaching practice. And the school said, we want you to stay with us 3 to 5 years. And I said, sure, I can do that. And so we made a tentative plan for how we would proceed, which developed into the research agenda that I am now just wrapping up, that has to do with reading comprehension and classroom discourse. So what you see here, this thematic link, so there's a link from my first projects about peer work to my current projects on reading comprehension having to do with classroom discourse and classroom interaction, even though the first was more about participation instructions, peer work, and this one is more about reading comprehension. So I'm still building on my pre-existing knowledge and the knowledge that I have been learning. So then I went through this series of projects, which included the one at the top, which was really just a fortuitous thing that came up, right? See, this whole strand is sort of fortuitous, not originally planned. The school asked me to do it. Okay, I'll take that on. And came up then with my colleague Kim, where she was doing conversation analysis, a very particular way of analyzing data that I don't do, and I'm not really expert in. But I thought would be a great way to look at the teacher interviews and understand them better. And so we did that together, and we just published on that. So if the idea is like building on your expertise and take advantage of your opportunities, this was again taking advantage of opportunities and also taking advantage of my colleagues' expertise. So where are we? Well, this is sort of how I see the overall thing. I started off by looking at classroom interactions and peer work, teacher concerns, materials development, and intervention, which generated a series of small projects. Each one had its own small grant. Because of that work with the school, I moved into working on the school and the teachers concerned around reading comprehension. Again, a series of small grants building up one by one based on what I was learning to get into the next project. What I didn't tell you about, I won't go into detail now about, is there was another strand of research that was generated by MOE concerns having to do with student engagement, and so there was a series of projects about that as well, but that is its own kind of offshoot. Along with all of that, I got interested in this idea about research management and how do we manage and share all of this data so that the money is really used wisely and well. And so then I had this other strand of research which is developed about data storage and secondary data analysis. The idea then is this builds, each cell builds on the others in a way that is sort of organic, I think, right? That it isn't, I started off with one idea, and then I went off in multiple directions, taking on different things. Okay, so what are the implications perhaps for you? Well, the money from the grants is really nice, but it's not all about the money. Right? Instead, it's also not just about like little grants and big grants. I have had ACRFs, ERFP, SUGs, development grants. I think I've tried just about every kind there is at NIE, but not all of them. And some of the small grants actually resulted in the best impact and the most publications. So it's really not about the money and the size of the grant, and it's not even about the type of grant that you get. Instead, I'd say it's a combination of intentionally forward planning what your research agenda will be. How will those projects build up over time? Following likely emergent leads, taking advantage of opportunities, focusing around some specific research themes, although I did go off in several directions. I hope I didn't go off in every direction. And that these can be developed through a series of PI-driven projects, but now we also have programmatic research where you could set up a series of projects or a group of related projects to tackle an issue from different perspectives with a group of different people. And I think it's important to remember that it rarely involves going it alone. Both of the previous speakers have mentioned people that they've worked with that were important in their projects, and I would echo that same thought. Thank you.